Welcome to American Legacies, where we explore incredible stories of the people who shaped the nation. From founders like Benjamin Franklin, to creators like Walt Disney, barrier breakers like Rosa Parks, to stars like Frank Sinatra. Whether they led revolutions, inspired generations, or changed the course of history, their stories are woven into the fabric of America. Join us as we uncover the triumphs, struggles, and legacies of the heroes of our country. Let's get started. What if the most groundbreaking poet of her time was hiding in plain sight? Emily Dickinson crafted some of the most daring and unique poetry ever written without ever seeking fame. Living a life of seclusion, she defied societal expectations, choosing instead to pour her soul into over 1,800 poems that would not be discovered until after her death. From her unconventional style to her fierce independence, Dickinson redefined the boundaries of poetry and made a profound impact on American literature. In this exploration of her life and legacy, we'll uncover the quiet brilliance of a woman whose words still resonate today, offering a glimpse into the heart and mind of a poet ahead of her time. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830, in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was the middle of three children in a prominent New England family. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a Yale-educated lawyer and later a politician active in the Whig Party. He served in the Massachusetts legislature and even a term in the U.S. Congress. Emily's mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, had been educated at Monson Academy and is often remembered as a quiet homemaker, though surviving letters hinted her intellect and wit. The Dickinson household valued education and civic duty, and young Emily grew up in an atmosphere of learning and community respect. From an early age, Emily received an exceptional education for a girl of her time. Along with her older brother William Austin and younger sister Lavinia, she attended primary school in Amherst before enrolling at the rigorous Amherst Academy. She spent about 7 years at Amherst Academy, studying a wide range of subjects from English literature to mathematics, natural science, and Latin. By her own account, she delighted in all aspects of the school: the challenging curriculum, engaging teachers, and her fellow students. Science in particular left a mark on her. She kept an herbarium of pressed plants for years and showed fascination with botanical and astronomical lectures. This scientific interest would later surface in her poetry's precise observations of nature. In the fall of 1847, 16-year-old Emily entered the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, now Mount Holyoke College, a prestigious women's boarding school. She spent 1 year there, the longest time she would ever live away from home, before returning to Amherst in 1848. Various reasons have been suggested for her brief stay at Mount Holyoke, including homesickness and discomfort with the school's intense evangelical religious fervor. Unlike many classmates, Emily did not experience a public conversion or declare a specific faith status, a spiritual independence she maintained throughout her life. Emily's childhood home life was happy but busy. When Emily was 9, the family moved from the grandfather's homestead on Main Street to a new house on Pleasant Street to accommodate Edward's growing political stature and the expanding family. Emily dearly loved the Pleasant Street house and enjoyed an active girlhood there. In those years, Emily participated in household chores like baking bread and gardening, learned to play piano and sing, attended church with her family, read widely, and roamed the fields and woods of Amherst with friends. She was especially close to her siblings Austin and Lavinia, who she called Vinnie, and formed a tight-knit circle of female friends during her teens. Emily enjoyed a lively social life as a teenager. Far from the later image of the reclusive spinster, young Emily was sociable and even mischievous. In one light-hearted letter, at age 15, she teased about her own blossoming charm, writing, "I expect I shall be the belle of Amherst when I reach my 17th year. I don't doubt that I will have crowds of admirers." This playful confidence shows a side of her that may surprise those who only know her as a withdrawn poet. Yet, even in youth, she experienced events that stirred deeper introspection. The family's house on Pleasant Street neighbored Amherst's town cemetery, so funerals were a familiar sight, and death was never far from her mind. When Emily was 14, one of her close cousins and friends, Sophia Holland, died of typhus, an early confrontation with loss that affected her profoundly. Shortly after, Emily herself fell ill, possibly from grief, and was sent away for a few weeks to recover. She returned home with a heightened preoccupation with death and immortality, themes that would later dominate much of her poetry. Religious revivals swept through New England during her adolescence, prompting nearly everyone around her to declare their faith and join the church. Emily's father, sister, and brother all eventually became members of Amherst's Congregational Church. But Emily pointedly did not. "I am one of the lingering bad ones," she joked to a friend, fully aware of how her refusal to make a public profession of faith set her apart. This gentle rebellion against religious and social expectations shows her independent spirit. Even as a young woman, she quietly insisted on defining her relationship to faith on her own terms. This inner independence, a preference for personal truth over societal approval, would characterize her life and work. In her late teens and early 20s, Emily began to channel her energy and intellect into writing. Having left formal schooling, she entered what biographers call her apprenticeship period, honing her skills through letters and occasional poems. Letter writing was a cherished activity for her, a way to maintain intimate connections with friends and to play with language. "I've been in the habit myself of writing some few things," she casually admitted in a teasing letter to her brother Austin, warning him that if he tried his hand at poetry, he might infringe on her territory. These early writings were mostly private exercises, but a couple of her youthful pieces found their way into print. At age 19, Emily published an anonymous prose piece, a witty Valentine letter, in the Amherst College student newspaper. 2 years later, a poem of hers appeared anonymously in the Springfield Daily Republican, a prominent regional newspaper. These publications were uncharacteristic and few. She later retreated from publishing, but they indicate that as a young adult, she was testing the waters of authorship. Encouraged by mentors and friends, she was beginning to consider what it meant to be a writer. Several influences in the early 1850s nurtured her literary spark. One important figure was Benjamin Franklin Newton, a young law student who had worked in her father's law office. Newton befriended Emily when she was a teenager and introduced her to the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, then a revolutionary American thinker and writer. Newton gave her a copy of Emerson's poetry, a gift Emily treasured deeply. She later wrote that Newton became to me a gentle yet grave preceptor, teaching me what to read, what authors to admire, crediting him for kindling her love of literature. Sadly, Newton died of tuberculosis when Emily was 22, but his impact endured in her expansive reading and imaginative ambition. Around the same time, Emily's world widened through travel. In 1854, she undertook a rare trip far from Amherst, accompanying her father to Washington, D.C. during his term in Congress, and on the way home, visiting Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, she met Reverend Charles Wadsworth, a charismatic Presbyterian minister renowned for his preaching. Emily was drawn to Wadsworth's intellect and spirit. She would later call him one of her masters, a term she used for a few men she greatly respected. Though Wadsworth was married and lived far away, he eventually moved to San Francisco. He and Emily began a correspondence that became emotionally important to her. The content of their letters remains largely mysterious, but the connection was deep enough that some scholars speculate he might have been an unseen muse for her more fervent poems. What is known is that Wadsworth's friendship gave her a window into a wider world, and perhaps into her own heart. It was an impassioned, yet largely epistolary relationship, setting a pattern for the intense, letter-bound friendships that marked her life. In 1855, a major change arrived at her doorstep. That year, Edward Dickinson decided to move his family back to the old homestead on Main Street, the house where Emily had been born, which he repurchased and renovated in grand style. The homestead was a stately Federal-style house, and Edward enhanced it with stylish modern additions, like a cupola and large windows, to suit the family's now well-to-do status. For 24-year-old Emily, the move was bittersweet. She had cherished the simpler home on Pleasant Street and the memories attached to it. "I cannot tell you how we moved. I had rather not remember," she wrote, describing the disruptive relocation back to Main Street as a moment of losing herself. "I am out with lanterns, looking for myself. This poetic remark to a friend reveals how uprooted she felt by leaving her beloved house and neighborhood. Nonetheless, the homestead would become the center of her world for the rest of her days. Here, in a room of her own on the second floor, her destiny as a poet truly unfolded. Back in Amherst and settled at the homestead, Emily found herself at a personal crossroads. The mid-1850s were a time of transition. She was a woman in her 20s, past school age, yet unlike many peers, she did not marry or start a household of her own. Instead, she remained in her parents' home, carving out an unconventional path of creativity. The close proximity of family could be both comfort and strain. Her dear friend Susan Gilbert had married Emily's brother and moved literally next door to a house called the Evergreens that Austin built for his new bride. In the early years of that marriage, the Evergreens became a social hub of Amherst society, a lively household of dinner parties and distinguished visitors, and Emily was a frequent guest in Sue and Austin's parlor. She adored her sister-in-law, Susan, who was her confidant and intellectual sparring partner, and she rejoiced as Susan and Austin's family grew. Emily delighted in the role of aunt, as Susan gave birth to Emily's beloved nephew, Edward, and niece Martha. Susan's children brought much joy to Emily's life, and letters show her playful, doting relationship with little Ned, despite her half-joking fear of joggling him when he was an infant. Yet, as Susan became occupied with motherhood and social obligations, a subtle distance grew between the two friends. Emily, always sensitive, may have felt left behind, as her darling Sue assumed new roles that Emily herself would never take on. Surrounded by the cycles of ordinary family life, births, marriages, daily social calls, Dickinson began to turn inward, choosing the company of her own thoughts more and more. It was during this period that she made a quiet, momentous decision to live the life of a poet, even if that meant retreating from many of the activities expected of women of her age and class. Around 1858, Emily embarked on what can be described as an extraordinary poetic flowering. Though she had written verses before, she now entered a phase of focused, prolific creativity that lasted through the Civil War years. Scholars often call 1858 to 1865 her writing years, when she produced hundreds of short revolutionary poems that would eventually secure her place in literary history. This surge coincided with profound changes in her personal life and the world around her. Nationally, the United States was torn apart by the Civil War, a conflict whose violence and tragedy gripped even those far from the battlefields. "War feels to me an oblique place," Emily wrote in 1863, as news of battles and casualties reached Amherst. One especially painful local loss was the death of Fraser Stearns, the son of the Amherst College president, and a young man Emily knew well, who was killed fighting for the Union. Dickinson keenly felt these sorrows. She described the telegram dropped so deep they keep weighing on her brother's mind when Fraser was killed. Yet, true to her nature, Emily processed these events through art more than activism. While other Americans wrote rousing war verses, for example, Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic, Emily's approach was indirect and intensely personal. During the war years, she wrote roughly half of her entire output of poetry, an astonishing fact. But none of her poems mention Lincoln or battlefields by name. Instead, she explored universal themes of death, hope, despair, and faith in elliptical, deeply original language. The Civil War remained for her a backdrop, a timeless test of the soul's endurance, rather than a subject for patriotic lyric. Her few concrete contributions to the war effort were characteristically under the radar. In early 1864, a handful of her poems were published anonymously in a Brooklyn newspaper called Drumbeat to help raise funds for Union soldiers' medical care. Apart from these, she kept nearly all her poetry private during this time. As Emily's poetic genius developed, her everyday life became increasingly reclusive and routine. By age 30, she had largely withdrawn from Amherst's social whirl. She stopped joining the rounds of calls on neighbors, rarely went to church or large gatherings, and she would avoid most face-to-face meetings with all but family. Friends noticed her absence from their circles and wondered. To one cousin, Emily frankly acknowledged she was not much seen about town. "I do not run away from you," she assured her. Biographers, have offered various reasons for her self-isolation. Some point to emotional shocks, possibly a romantic disappointment or unrequited love, that left her feeling spiritually raw. Others note her innate need for solitude to create, the time and freedom to write without interruption. Indeed, Dickinson herself explained that social duties and household chores could be anathema to artistic work. She gradually pruned away distractions to devote herself to poetry. Rather than entertain callers in the parlor, she poured her heart into intimate letters. For Emily, letter writing was visiting at its best, an unhurried, thoughtful exchange without the trivial chatter of daily visits. This careful curation of her social life allowed her to focus intensely on her inner world. Within the quiet refuge of the homestead, Emily established a daily pattern conducive to writing. Her father, though authoritarian in some respects, supported her need for a private workspace. As part of the 1855 renovations, Edward Dickinson had built a small conservatory greenhouse for Emily's plants, indulging her love of gardening, and he respected her use of her bedroom as a kind of creative studio. Emily's room, a southwest corner chamber on the second floor, had two big windows with views of the family orchard and the hills beyond. Here she placed a little table, famously a 17-inch square table, by the window, and it was on this humble surface that she wrote nearly all her poems in pencil on scraps of paper. The image of Emily at her tiny desk, crafting lines of immortal verse in almost illegible handwriting, is iconic. Visitors to the homestead today often remark on how small her writing table was, marveling at how much had flowed from so small a space. But she seemed to thrive in miniature and in concentration. Surrounded by the daily life of her family, she could hear the doorbell ring downstairs or the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. She nonetheless inhabited vast realms in her imagination. She wrote at night and during the day, in notebooks and on loose sheets, sometimes drafting poems on the backs of recipes in old envelopes, whatever was at hand. For Emily, the creative act mingled seamlessly with domestic life. One might find a poem scribbled on a chocolate wrapper or in the margins of a household account book. The scale of Dickinson's creativity in this period is staggering. When she was 35, she had composed more than 1,100 poems. Many of these she copied out neatly and bound in the small homemade booklets, now known as fascicles. She stitched together folded sheets and transcribed her verses in ink, assembling at least 40 such booklets by hand. These fascicles were essentially her private volumes of poetry, a one-woman press run. Strikingly, she shared these booklets with no one in her lifetime. They were discovered only after her death. It appears she treated the fascicles as a form of self-publication or archival record without any intent to seek a public audience. In fact, during her life she showed ambivalence or outright resistance to publishing her work professionally. A few of her poems did slip into print in the late 1850s and early 1960s, often without her name and sometimes without her consent. For example, friends submitted some poems to newspapers. One famous poem, A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, was published anonymously under the title The Snake. But these were exceptions. The vast majority of her nearly 1,800 poems stayed in manuscript form, seen only by those she chose to enclose in letters or present as little gifts. Emily did, however, seek a discerning reader for her work in one important case. In April 1862, she took the bold step of writing to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a prominent literary figure and abolitionist, after reading an essay of his in the Atlantic Monthly titled Letter to a Young Contributors. In her now famous introductory letter, the 31-year-old poet humbly asked Higginson, "Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive?" She enclosed a few poems. Higginson, though startled by the originality of Dickinson's verses, found them almost baffling, wrote back kindly, and became a long-term correspondent and mentor of sorts to her. Over the next 2 decades, Higginson and Dickinson exchanged letters regularly, and she sent him nearly 100 poems for feedback. Higginson visited her in Amherst years later and was one of the few outsiders she allowed into her inner sanctum. Their correspondence illustrates Dickinson's simultaneous desire for validation and her reluctance to alter her unconventional style to meet editorial standards. Higginson advised her against publishing in 1862, suggesting the public wasn't ready for her jagged, strange poetry, advice she seemed content to follow. Dickinson's verses of this era broke so many rules of 19th-century poetry. They were short, untitled lyrics that often employed slant rhymes, near rhymes, instead of perfect rhymes, and they were peppered with her trademark dashes and idiosyncratic capitalization. In theme and tone, they were utterly unique, compressed nuggets of wit and emotion that could be unsettling in their honesty. She wrote about life's big questions: death, God, nature, love, with a fierce brevity that had no precedent. As one literary scholar noted, she challenged the existing definitions of poetry and the poet's work, crafting a new language for what was possible, but not yet realized. In doing so, Dickinson was pushing the boundaries of art, much like her contemporary Walt Whitman, though the two never met. Whitman's expansive free verse and Dickinson's terse elliptical poems were opposite in style, yet both were revolutionizing American poetry from different angles in the mid-19th century. While Dickinson's creativity soared, observers in Amherst saw the young woman becoming more eccentric. By the early 1860s, local people whispered about the myth of the reclusive Miss Dickinson, who rarely ventured out and who dressed only in white, like a spectral figure in the house on the hill. Indeed, at some point in her 30s, Emily did begin favoring white clothing. When Colonel Higginson met her in person in 1870, he reported that the poet was dressed in a very plain and exquisitely clean white peak and a blue net worsted shawl. Neighbors speculated endlessly about the lady in white. One newcomer to town, Mabel Loomis Todd, who would later play a key role in Emily's legacy, wrote in 1881 that Amherst's famous resident dresses wholly in white, and her mind is said to be perfectly wonderful, noting that the town already regarded Emily as something of a mythic character. Dickinson herself never explained her fashion choice. Intriguingly, none of her surviving letters mention her penchant for white dresses, and photographs from her youth show her in dark clothing. Some have theorized that white represented for her a symbol of purity or a kind of bridal metaphor, to art or to God, while others point out it was a practical color for a homemaker, easy to wash and bleach in an era before modern detergents. Whatever the reason, the sight of Emily Dickinson walking briskly in her family garden or standing at the door in a white frock became one of the lasting images of her legend. So much so that she was buried in a white gown and laid in a white coffin when she died. Despite her withdrawal from society, Dickinson was not isolated from joy or companionship. A charming example of her engagement with the world is her relationship with her big, beloved dog. In 1850, Emily's father presented her with a Newfoundland puppy, a large, intelligent breed, whom she named Carlo, inspired by the dog in Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. Carlo grew to be a huge creature and became her constant walking companion. She roamed the woods and fields of Amherst with Carlo by her side, finding solace in nature and a wordless understanding with her pet. In a letter introducing herself to T.W. Higginson, Emily playfully described her everyday companions. "Hills, sir, and the sundown, and a dog, large as myself. They are better than beings because they know, but do not tell." For 16 years, Carlo was her faithful shaggy ally, as she called him, a source of unconditional love and grounding. When Carlo died in 1866, Dickinson was heartbroken. Those close to her observed that her seclusion deepened after the loss of her cherished dog. It was as if, with Carlo's passing, one more tie to the external world was severed. Yet Emily carried on, with her family and her garden to keep her company, and, of course, her ever-flowing imagination. By the mid-1860s, Emily Dickinson had inwardly committed herself to a writer's life, even if that meant living unconventionally. It is important to note that within the walls of her home, she was not melancholic or idle. Far from it. Family members, and the few friends with whom she kept up correspondence, found her a sparkling, if private, presence. The kitchen was one place where Emily shone in a traditional role, even as she subverted it in her own way. She was an accomplished baker, known for the best bread in the household. Her father supposedly refused to eat any bread but hers. In 1856, she and her sister Lavinia even entered a local baking contest at the Amherst Cattle Show. Emily's homemade Indian and rye bread won second prize, with Vinnie as one of the judges, no less. Emily took pride in her culinary art. She spoke of her twin loaves of bread as the glory of the household and delighted in making desserts, remarking dreamily that people must have puddings. Her love of baking was another way she expressed affection and maintained bonds. Dickinson often sent cakes, candies, and recipes as tokens of friendship. For instance, when Susan Dickinson was away teaching in Baltimore, Emily mailed her some of her favorite rice cake with a tender note. "How happy I am to send you anything you love." Neighborhood children, too, benefited from Emily's kitchen kindness. A favorite local anecdote recalls how Aunt Emily would lower a little basket filled with her famously rich gingerbread from her window down to the eager children below. In such moments, rather than a hermit, we see Dickinson as a beloved if somewhat enigmatic figure in the community, intimately bound to the community by her quiet generosity. "Love's oven is warm," she once quipped, in a note accompanying a batch of homemade caramels. After 1865, Emily rarely left the boundaries of the homestead. The end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction coincided with a turning inward for her. She had spent several months in Boston for medical treatment of an eye ailment, likely iritis, a painful inflammation. Those trips to the city were the last significant journeys of her life. Following her return to Amherst, with her eyesight improved, Emily entered what one might call a voluntary cloister, though it was within her family home rather than a convent. For the next 2 decades, she very seldom ventured beyond her house and garden. She even stopped attending church altogether. On the rare occasions she did leave home, it was only as far as the next-door evergreens or a carriage ride with her sister to get some air. Her world became small in geography, but not in intellect or emotion. Dickinson's reclusiveness in these years became legendary. She was sometimes seen as a pale figure at an upstairs window, or gardeners would glimpse her tending her beloved flowers in the conservatory, but many in Amherst never saw her in person for years on end. She took to handling certain interactions in unconventional ways. If someone rang the doorbell to call on the family, Emily might remain out of sight and let Vinnie or the servants answer. In some cases, she communicated with visitors from behind a closed door rather than face-to-face, an almost theatrical touch that people talked about. One oft-cited description from a local newspaper recounts how she would speak to visitors from behind her bedroom door, not out of rudeness, but seemingly out of shyness or an extreme need for personal space. And yet, those who did interact with her, in writing or from behind that door, felt the force of her personality. Emily could be dazzlingly witty, warm, and even playful in her correspondence, belying the notion that she was simply a sad, hermit-like figure. As a modern curator at the Dickinson Museum puts it, the popular image of her as a quiet, meek spinster is misleading. Her life, even in reclusion, was often bright and beautiful in its devotion to art, nature, and those she loved. She maintained an active correspondence with dozens of friends and relatives, writing letters that were rich with humor, puns, and insight. These letters were lifelines that kept her emotionally connected, even as she kept physical distance. During the late 1860s and 1870s, Dickinson continued to write poetry, though at a less feverish pace. Importantly, she stopped assembling her poems into the neat fascicles. The manuscripts from her later years often exist as scraps jotted on whatever paper was handy, envelopes, bills, or folded notepaper, as if she wrote spontaneously and left the drafts as they were. Scholars who study these later fragments find them intriguing. The rough, experimental state of some poems suggests she was still evolving artistically, and perhaps became less concerned with perfecting copies of her work. A few outside readers beyond her immediate circle did get to see Emily's poems in these years. On one occasion, Colonel Higginson, who remained her correspondent, read a selection of poems by 2 unknown authors to the New England Woman's Club in Boston. One of those anonymous authors was almost certainly Emily Dickinson. He kept her name secret, but it shows that he was quietly trying to champion her talent among literary circles even while she remained a homebound mystery. Another friend-turned-admirer, the writer Helen Hunt Jackson, persistently urged Emily to publish. Jackson, an Amherst native and successful author, wrote to Dickinson pleading for a contribution to an anthology of anonymous poetry she was compiling. "Could you not bear this much of publicity?" Helen begged, promising Emily that she would include the poems without naming the author if only Emily would consent. In response, whether out of acquiescence or perhaps without her explicit permission, one of Dickinson's poems, Success is Counted Sweetest, was in fact published anonymously in that collection. This was a small triumph. Readers encountered Emily's verse, albeit unsigned, in a mainstream book while she was still alive, marking one of the few times her work reached print in the 1870s. Jackson declared Dickinson's poetry to be the finest thought and rarest workmanship, firmly believing Emily was a great genius hiding herself. Still, Emily demurred at any overtures to publish more broadly. It seems no amount of urging could draw her out of her chosen privacy. She once wryly stated, in response to the idea of fame, "Publication is as foreign to me as firmament to Finn." Public life was as unnatural to her as the sky to a fish. Though she renounced marriage and most social engagements, love was not absent from her later life. She enjoyed a tender, clandestine romance with Judge Otis Phillips Lord, an old family friend. Lord was a widowed judge from Salem, Massachusetts, and had been a confidant of Emily's father. After Emily's father died, Lord began courting her through affectionate letters. Emily, nearly 50, and seemingly settled into single life, found herself considering an unexpected possibility of late-life marriage. Drafts of her letters to Judge Lord survive, full of pet names and deep feeling. She even contemplated leaving Amherst to live with him, an astonishing idea for someone who rarely left her house. But ultimately, she did not marry the judge. Lord's health was failing, and he died before they could be united. Still, their correspondence was a source of great happiness to Emily in her 50s, revealing a passionate side that few others saw. It's evidence that Dickinson's capacity for love and longing remained vibrant, refuting any notion that she had turned emotionally cold in her isolation. The 1870s and 80s brought hardships and sorrows. Emily endured a series of losses in her family circle that left her increasingly burdened by grief. Her sturdy father, Edward, died unexpectedly in 1874 while away on a trip to Boston. He collapsed in a hotel room, and the news was brought back to the homestead by telegram. Emily mourned him deeply, writing later, "A great darkness is over us." The next year, her mother suffered a paralytic stroke that left her an invalid for the remainder of her life. Emily and Vinnie spent the better part of the next 7 years nursing their mother, who became bedridden. This caregiving, though taxing, also drew Emily closer to her mother than they had ever been. In those years of dependency, a tender bond formed. Her mother died in 1882, an event that Emily met with quiet resignation and the comfort of having fulfilled her duty of care. The blows kept coming. Emily's 8-year-old nephew Gib died suddenly of typhoid fever. Little Gib was a particular favorite of Aunt Emily, who had often played with him. Losing him devastated her. "The crisis of the sorrow of so many years is all that tires me," she wrote after Gib's death, her spirit nearly exhausted by cumulative grief. Not long after, Judge Otis Lord passed away, and the following year her dear friend Helen Hunt Jackson also died. It seemed to Emily that one by one, the bright lights of her intimate world were being extinguished. Her health, which had generally been robust, began to fail. The exact nature of her final illness isn't fully clear from historical records, but modern scholars suspect kidney disease or severe hypertension as likely culprits. She became weak and was often confined to bed. In her last known letter, written to her cousins, she only managed a brief, poignant line. "Little cousins, called back." Emily died at home on May 15, 1886, at the age of 55. Her family buried her in Amherst's West Cemetery, in a white coffin covered in violets and pine boughs, under a humble gravestone that carries only 2 words, "Called back." That phrase, taken from a popular novel of the time, was a way of saying she was called back to eternity. At the small funeral in the homestead's library, her siblings Vinnie and Austin, Sue, and a few close friends listened as Thomas Wentworth Higginson read Emily's favorite poem by Emily Bronte, "No Coward Soul Is Mine." They laid her to rest in the family plot, closing the life of one of the most singular individuals America had ever seen. In a quiet act of defiance against death's finality, Dickinson's family planted lady slipper orchids on her grave. Delicate wildflowers that return each spring, a living echo of the nature she so loved. At the time of her death, Emily was virtually unknown to the wider world. Only a handful of her poems had been published, and those were anonymous, often altered to conventional form. She had shared her art mostly in letters and little personal booklets. Yet she left behind an immense treasure, nearly 1,800 poems, carefully saved in drawers and boxes, and the rich correspondence in which she had poured out her mind and heart. The responsibility of what to do with this legacy fell to her younger sister, Lavinia. In the days after Emily's funeral, as her family sorted through her possessions, Lavinia Vinnie Dickinson made the find of a lifetime. Dozens of manuscript packets of poems, tied with string, hidden in a dresser drawer. Vinnie knew her sister wrote poetry, but even she was astonished by the sheer volume. Emily had left no explicit instructions in her will about her poems. She had only instructed that her letters be burned, a wish that Vinnie dutifully carried out, regrettably destroying much biographical information in the process. But the poems were another matter. As Vinnie later recalled, "I have had a Joan of Arc feeling about Emily's poems from the first, believing she was divinely appointed to bring her sister's genius to light." Immediately, Lavinia resolved that Emily's poetry must be made public. It was a daunting task. Hundreds upon hundreds of poems, many barely edited, written in a private code of dashes and unconventional punctuation. Vinnie, determined but unskilled in editing, turned to people who had known Emily for help. The first two people Lavinia approached were Susan Dickinson, Emily's closest friend and her brother's wife, and Thomas W. Higginson, the very mentor who had gently critiqued Emily's poems decades earlier. Both Susan and Higginson recognized the brilliance of Dickinson's verses, but for various reasons, neither moved quickly enough for Lavinia's satisfaction. Susan, who possessed some of Emily's poems that Emily had sent her over the years, seemed to get bogged down, perhaps due to her own deep emotional connection to the work, or possibly the demands of her life. Higginson, living in New England, admired the poems, but was busy and uncertain how to present such radical poetry to the public. Impatient to fulfill her sacred duty, Lavinia then made a fateful choice. She reached out to Mabel Loomis Todd, a young Amherst College faculty wife who, though she had never met Emily in person, was enthusiastic about her poems. Todd was an energetic, artistic woman, and, complicating matters, she was involved in a scandalous love affair with Emily's married brother, Austin. Despite this delicate situation, Sue and Austin had become estranged due to Austin's liaison with Mabel. Lavinia decided that Mabel Todd's skills and eagerness made her the right person to help edit Emily's poems. It was a decision that would shape the course of Dickinson's legacy for decades. Mabel Loomis Todd threw herself into the work of preparing Emily's poems for publication. Teaming up with Colonel Higginson as co-editor, she spent nights transcribing Emily's handwritten poems, struggling to decipher the handwriting and dashes, organizing them, and making editorial decisions to suit the literary conventions of the time. In 1890, a mere 4 years after Emily's death, the first volume of Poems by Emily Dickinson was published, thanks to Todd's perseverance and Higginson's guidance. This first edition contained about 115 of Dickinson's poems, but notably, the editors had taken liberties. They regularized her punctuation, removing her trademark dashes, altered words they found strange, added titles to poems that originally had none, and generally made the poems look more normal by Victorian standards. Despite, or perhaps partly because of these alterations, the book was a stunning success. The 1890 volume of poems went through 11 editions in less than 2 years, a remarkable reception for a poet entirely unknown to the public just shortly before. The freshness of Dickinson's voice, even toned down, captivated readers and created a small literary sensation. Reviewers marveled at the originality of this posthumous poet from Amherst, and the book's popularity encouraged the editors to move forward with more. Later, Mabel Todd and T.W. Higginson followed up with a second volume of poems, and Todd, working essentially alone by then, produced a collection of Emily's selected letters in 1894 and a third series of poems in 1896. The public's curiosity was intense. Who was this mysterious genius who had dwelt in obscurity? Todd gave lectures and wrote articles to promote Dickinson's poetry, sharing carefully curated anecdotes. She did not mention, for example, that she was Austin Dickinson's mistress, or any details that might scandalize readers. Instead, Todd amplified the image of Emily as a mystical recluse in white, a New England saint of poetry. Her efforts helped build the Dickinson legend and expand the poet's posthumous fame. By the mid-1890s, Emily Dickinson's name was becoming known in literary circles in America and even abroad. Her poetry, strikingly concise, often philosophical or whimsical, stood in stark contrast to the flowery, sentimental verse popular at the time. Many readers found it bracing and profound. However, the collaboration between the Dickinson family and Mabel Loomis Todd did not last peacefully. Underlying tensions exploded when a legal dispute over a piece of land, a boundary issue between the homestead and the evergreens next door, pitted Mabel Todd against Dickinson family members. The lawsuit turned bitter, effectively severing the relationship between Mabel and Lavinia, and Mabel and Susan, who already disliked each other. In the aftermath, Mabel Loomis Todd abruptly withdrew from the Dickinson project, literally locking away the trove of original manuscripts still in her possession, many of which Emily had sent to Sue or had been lent to Mabel, in a chest in her attic. For over 30 years, Mabel refused to even look at an Emily Dickinson poem. She wouldn't even raise the lid of the chest because of the rancor with the Dickinson heirs. During this time, Lavinia passed away, and Higginson died in 1911. The torch of editing fell to a new guardian, Maddie Dickinson Bianchi, Emily's favorite niece. Maddie had grown up next door to Aunt Emily and inherited many manuscripts that Emily gave to Susan or other family members. Maddie Bianchi took it upon herself to continue publishing her aunt's work. Between 1914 and 1934, Bianchi brought out several new collections of Emily Dickinson's poetry and some personal memoirs about her aunt. Bianchi's editions were somewhat more faithful to Emily's originals than Todd's had been. For instance, Bianchi did not give the poems titles and preserved more of Dickinson's original rhymes. Bianchi was also motivated to protect her aunt's legacy from what she saw as distortions. She authored memoirs, such as Face to Face with Emily Dickinson, asserting her unique perspective as someone who had known Emily intimately, countering speculative biographies or plays that were starting to appear. Thanks to Bianchi's efforts, new generations of readers in the 1920s and 1930s discovered Dickinson's poetry, keeping her flame alive in the public consciousness. The estrangement between the Todd family and the Dickinson family softened with time. In the 1930s, Mabel Loomis Todd's daughter, Millicent Todd Bingham, became interested in completing her mother's unfinished Dickinson work. Millicent had grown up aware that her mother held a chest of unpublished poems. After Mabel's death, Millicent opened the chest and began collaborating with scholarly editors to produce yet more Dickinson material. In 1945, Millicent published Bolts of Melody, a volume containing the poems that remained from her mother's cache. By the mid-20th century, nearly all of Emily Dickinson's known poems had finally seen print, but they were scattered across multiple volumes, edited by often competing parties, with varying degrees of fidelity to the originals. The true restoration of Dickinson's artistic voice came in 1955. In that year, scholar Thomas Johnson published the Poems of Emily Dickinson, a monumental academic edition that for the first time collected all of her poems in one work. Johnson went back to the source manuscripts, many by then housed in Harvard's library or at Amherst College, rather than reprinting from the previous edited versions. He preserved Dickinson's unique punctuation and spelling as best as possible in print, and arranged the poems in a chronological order based on his best estimates of when they were written. The Johnson edition was a watershed for Dickinson studies. At last, readers and critics could encounter Emily Dickinson's poetry more nearly as she wrote it, without the heavy hand of 19th-century edits. The result was a tremendous surge in Dickinson's reputation and influence. Scholars dove into analysis of her themes, style, and enigmatic lines. Poets of the 1950s and 60s, from Robert Frost to Adrienne Rich, drew inspiration from her razor-sharp imagery and courage of expression. Emily Dickinson, once a village oddity, was now securely enshrined as a central figure of American literature. Subsequent scholarship only deepened appreciation for Dickinson's originality. In 1981, editor Ralph Franklin published the manuscript books of Emily Dickinson, reproducing photographs of her fascicles and loose sheets, and in 1998, he issued a revised complete edition of the poems that refined Johnson's chronological ordering. Every decade, new discoveries or interpretations emerge. For example, a study using infrared technology found erased pencil markings indicating that Mabel Todd, while editing, had deliberately removed Susan Dickinson's name from some poem dedications, hinting at potential secrets in Emily and Susan's relationship. Dickinson's legacy is still evolving as scholars and fans seek to understand the woman behind the art. Critics praise her for the sheer genius of her language and the depth of her insight. Her use of slant rhyme and freeform has been credited with liberating poets from strict form, much as her contemporary Walt Whitman did with free verse. Like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were earlier influences she admired, Dickinson broke free of old constraints to express a new kind of individualism. And like her beloved Bronte and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, female literary heroes of hers, she proved that a woman's intimate first-person voice could carry cosmic weight. Beyond the sphere of literature, Dickinson's life story has also captured the popular imagination. The image of the brilliant recluse, writing in solitude, has inspired countless biographies, plays, and even TV shows. Casual readers are intrigued by the contrast between her outwardly quiet life in small-town Amherst and the extraordinary legacy she left. Her poems are widely quoted and taught in schools around the world. They've been translated into many languages, set to music, and recited in films. In Amherst, the homestead and the evergreens have been preserved as the Emily Dickinson Museum, where visitors can walk through the very rooms she lived in, see the modest white dress she supposedly wore, and the tiny desk where she wrote. Standing in her bedroom, visitors often feel, as one poet said, a wonder at how much had flowed from so small a space, noting that the very constraints of her physical world may have sharpened the intensity of her art. Dickinson's legacy also includes what she means as a model of individuality. In an era when women's voices were often dismissed, she remained true to her own unconventional style and perspective. She never sought validation through marriage or publication, choices that defied the norms of her time, yet she achieved a kind of immortality through the power of staying authentic to herself. Her life story resonates with anyone who has wondered about the value of a contemplative, self-directed life. It shows that a person can live a small life geographically and socially and still achieve greatness on her own terms. In her absolute fidelity to her art and beliefs, Dickinson has become an inspiring figure, especially for creative introverts and for women artists, carving out their space. As the Dickinson scholar and poet Adrienne Rich observed, Emily's solitary courage opened up a new place for poets, proving that to be private is not to be powerless. Emily Dickinson's life is a study in paradox. A retiring Amherst woman who barely left her home, yet whose words have traveled the globe and lodged in countless hearts. She lived in the polar privacy of a soul admitted to itself, as she once wrote. But from that seeming solitude, she spoke to universal human experiences. In a very real sense, she succeeded in dwelling in possibility, the house of creativity she celebrated in one of her poems. Her legacy is the assurance that the life of the mind knows no bounds, and that a singular voice, if nurtured with courage and care, can echo across centuries. Thanks for listening in on our journey into the fascinating life of Emily Dickinson. Join us next time as we consider another of our country's greatest treasures here on American Legacies. See you then.